This is the Vision 79 podcast, where my friend Sander and myself, Mason, discuss recent developments in our business and personal growth. The name Vision 79 comes from our respective racing numbers. Sander's is 40, mine is 39, and we have a shared vision for success in business and our personal lives. Many successful people have started small, just like us, but very few of them have documented their early years. They often say they wish they had, and given we believe in learning lessons from others, we intend to be the first to document our journey from start to finish. Today, we'll discuss why disagreement is so hated in our country right now, especially around this recent election, how to disagree effectively, why people disagree, and why you can do it without getting emotional. But first, we like to start every podcast with a brief update on where we're at in our business and personal lives. So when we go back and look at these later in our lives, we can kind of gauge where we're at. So what do you have for business this week?
Almost finished up with reviewing the Forex classes I started quite a while back. Should start trading maybe Monday, Tuesday, get my stuff set up and get that buttoned. I progressed a little bit through dropshipping stuff, reviewing, getting some progress on that front, and played around with Grok 2.0 a little bit, which I actually used for some of the podcast stuff today.
Cool.
Really liked it.
What podcast?
To give our topic today. Seemed to give a little bit more developed answers than ChatGPT. And additionally, what I really like is it actually will cite people on Twitter who have had commentary on the same topic that you're asking. So like if you ask a question about X topic, it will cite comments of different people that also have an opinion about that topic from the Twitter feed. Kind of thought that was a cool little tidbit. It's not perfect. You can't like give it an image and then ask it to generate something similar, although you can't do that in ChatGPT.
Yeah.
So, you know, it is what it is, but some cool little thingy. But what do you have for business? You want me to do personal or?
No, I'll run through business real quick. I completed the events list that I had started working on last week. That's finished now. I regained my footing with the equipment list and marked a couple other questions that I have. I researched more on the POS system and the product that we're going to be selling. And then I've started working more on the digital media products that we have to have before kickoff. Also, I have the Vision 79 t-shirts almost ready to go.
Oh, yes.
I fixed the logo, and today I got it. I really want it on a navy shirt. I'd like a navy one. I don't want them all to be white, but it's tough because the car is black. So on navy, it's not going to show up.
We could invert the colors on the car, too.
I tried that, but it looks really weird inverted. It just doesn't look right, the car. Okay. But I was able to give it an outline, and it looks much better. So I've got a couple other versions that I'm going to finish up tonight and then send over to you and see what you think. But I think those would be cool. If anybody wants to buy a one-off shirt, we can put in a one-off order. And then lastly, Everett launched his product, Tiave Tea, at Kraken this week.
Yes.
They're going to be selling it at Pauhana too, but they need another kegerator. They don't have enough lines right now, but as soon as that line comes in, they'll get it. I think that they're going to be getting it quickly because it was fucking slammed on Friday night. Dude, bleep this out, but actually, fuck it. I'll tell you after the podcast. They did really, really well. There were a lot of people. They made a lot of fucking money. And I met Everett's parents. Over half the people there I didn't recognize. That's strictly just people that Everett brought in on his own with his tea. But it went gangbusters, dude. It was awesome. So I'm super proud of him. I'd like to have him on.
Yeah, we should do it
next week.
Next week would be a really good week because I had an idea proposal for 39 and 40 that I wanted to run by you.
Okay.
We could talk about it after the podcast.
Okay. Do you want to talk about it now?
we can talk about it now. Maybe someone comments and sees what they think. I was thinking we could go through these. I was thinking we could maybe go for 39. You could look back at where you were a year from that day, wherever we do it, to where you are today. And kind of like maybe for the first part of our segment, kind of go through like what growth we've had, and maybe within your analysis of like the growth that you have or the amount that you've had, you could maybe pick like a topic or two within that, and then we can discuss it together. So kind of going over like the 39 aspect of the 39 and 40 side of Vision 79.
Sure,
and then for podcast 40, I could do the same thing for the growth within the past year, kind of highlight one topic or question that I have within there, and then we can discuss that for the podcast. I thought it would be cool to like commemorate 39 and 40 in terms of like the podcast numbers with our growth in that time period.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Cool. So then 38 would be with Everett, and 39 and 40.
Yeah, so we could ask her about next week.
Yeah, so then 38 would be with Everett, and 39 and 40.
Yeah, so we could ask her about next week.
Yeah,
So
that's good. What about lice?
lice. I did a bunch of home cleaning yesterday. Cleaned up the house. I got some bins back from when I sold the Hot Wheels to the guy.
Cool.
So I got my bins back. I spent a little while looking for my squirrels because I couldn't find them in my back porch, but I did find them. They are still alive, and they were playing today. So they were running around on the screens and stuff, and like, you know, just jumping around. He did like a little hop thing on the ground. He was looking at me, and he did like a little like vertical levitating style hop. It was really funny. They're super cute, but they're getting big. They're like this long now.
That's a nice squirrel.
Yeah, they're like this long. Their tail isn't quite bushy enough yet.
Yeah.
So it's not fully about you, but they're probably total length about that long, and they started off like that. So they've grown a ton. But yeah, good little guys. They're eating their normal food. They figured out my water dispenser that I have for them, how to use that. So they're drinking water.
That's good.
So yeah, they're doing good.
Sweet.
Yeah.
Is that it?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, nothing really eventful has happened. I went to work this week, and
That's a bummer.
yeah, but we have Monday off. Right?
I don't have
Veterans
Monday
Day?
off.
You don't have Veterans Day off?
Nope.
Wow.
Which is fucking hilarious.
That's wild for a defense contracting company.
Yeah, you would think, right? But I don't know. I guess if I'm gonna have to work a holiday, I would rather work Veterans Day, because it's like we're like, you guys get a day off, we've got you covered today. You know what I mean? Kind of like that. I don't know.
Yeah.
Whatever. I'll be there tomorrow. But for my life update, I now own crypto, which I wasn't expecting to have. But when you were gambling on the election, today's election theme,
Oh, true.
kind of, not really.
I bet on the election, so I made a little bit of money.
Right. I was telling
Not a lot, like $120. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, but you only put in $100, so that's a good return.
Yeah.
But I was telling Justin about it, and so we were pulling up that stuff at work, and we pulled it up on Polymarket because I had heard about a bunch of ads and stuff. I heard about it on the Wall Street Journal, and I was looking at it, and I was like, dude, this is sick. I wonder if you can bet on sports here, because our friend Ryan has been sports betting and made like several $1,000s. And I watch every Formula One competitive session there is, so why not make money doing it, right? So I was like, I wonder if they have it for Formula One, and they do. And they don't on they do on Hard Rock Bets, but the problem with Hard Rock Bets is I put $100 down on Charles Leclerc to win the race. And if he doesn't win, I lose my money. And if he does, then I double my money. Cool. But with Polymarket, the odds trade like stock. So if today I think Charles Leclerc is going to win and no one else does, and I buy Charles Leclerc at 20% likelihood, but then he qualifies on pole and I sell because he jumps up to 80%, then I make 60%. And then he can lose the race and it doesn't matter because I've already made my nut. And then I can enjoy the race without like having money on the mind. But to do that, you have to buy crypto. So I had Justin help me make a crypto account. I don't understand any of it. I just needed him to like get the money into where I could like bid on it.
Yeah.
But that's been fun. And then yesterday I stopped by Florida Tech had a regatta at C54. So I went there and hung out with a bunch of my rowing friends, which was nice. So yeah, it was a good week. Got a lot of work done.
Yeah, I don't think I have anything else. I thought about it a little bit. So
cool.
Yeah, let's dive into the main topic. I'm excited for this one.
Okay.
Good.
Okay, so I have a little intro for it. This week was the 2024 presidential election, and I'm so pleased with the outcome because it's been less than a week and it's already over. There's no disputes, there's no protests, there's no rallies, there's no issues.
Well, there are protests, but
they're not on the scale that there was last time or even from then.
Yeah.
It kind of sucks that I feel that way, actually, because I think that the way our country is run is important, and yet I detest being involved in it because of how opinionated everything is. And I've determined that the specific reason I'm so off-put by politics is as a direct result of today's topic. Though not limited to politics, the recent election is a great example of people hating someone for an opinion they hold, regardless of their reasoning or demeanor. And so I want to be leveraging that recent event in all of what we talk about today. Do you have anything to say on the main theme? Do you have an introductory paragraph?
No, not really. But I think that the one thing I'll say is that I think as we go through this topic, it's going to come down a lot to differentiating between an emotional disagreement and a logical disagreement.
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe for the audience, keep that in mind as we go through. I think you'll see a trend and a distinction between the two, and additionally an important distinction that will be characteristic of the effectivity of your debate or conversation.
Do you have personal examples of times that someone has gotten upset with you for opinion that you hold, even though you're being nice about it?
Sure. Yeah.
Give me
yeah. well, when I started leaning more conservative and I went back home to Massachusetts, there was a large push on my dad's side of the family to support like defund the police movement specifically. And I wasn't like, I was kind of more middle. Like I wasn't even like crazy onto one side or another because I was just learning, and I was involved, but I was involved at a superficial level. And to me, just logically, it didn't make sense to defund the police because if there are issues, how does giving them less support solve the problems, right? Like that was my perspective back then. And I remember my dad just being like really upset and like really puckered up, and you know, me talking to him about some of this stuff, just being like, I was just passively being like, I just don't know if this is the right move to like defund the police department.
Right.
Like, I just don't like, I don't understand how that solves the issue. And it felt more like it just came from a punishment perspective, where my dad was like, the police departments need to be punished for their institutionalized racism that they've propagated over the last century, right? And I was like, you know, I later on, I looked at the data, and it really opened my eyes to like kind of what is the issue in reality versus what's not the issue, what is being just thrown up as propaganda, what is true, what is not talked about, stuff like that. But I remember him getting really upset, and I was like, you know, because in his mind, he was like, we need to defund them in the sense of taking away money allocation from these things that are blown way out of proportion and kind of cut the budgets down and then reform it. And I was like, I didn't really buy it as a solution, but it was interesting because then his girlfriend brought up the idea that like some people want to eliminate the police. And that is also part of like the defund the police movement.
It's creative.
And yeah. And I was like, I cannot support that at all. Like, I think that's crazy. Like, to completely eliminate any sort of police. Like, we live in a society where we give up some of our rights in order for the betterment of the society as a whole, as our safety. Like, we give up our, for example, like we pay some of our taxes in order to support these programs that protect us ourselves, right? Yeah. We can't yell fire in a crowded theater, right? Stuff like that, where we give up some portion of like our complete freedom, right? Like we can't punch someone in the face on the street, right? Sure. So we give up some of our freedoms, whether they're good or bad, is up for debate, in order to have a functioning and safe society. And police are an integral part of keeping that safety in line, right? And so my dad's girlfriend brought up the idea that some people want to completely eliminate the police because there's so much institutionalized racism, there's no hope for it, and it needs to be completely eliminated, and then started back up from the ground up.
Right.
And I remember my dad getting not upset, but like kind of jarred by that, because he didn't support completely eliminating the police. But I think for a moment he kind of saw that like the movement he's advocating for.
He was jarred by his girlfriend's perspective, or yours?
No, that wasn't her perspective. She was just saying that that's some people on the defund the police side, and these people and the people that my dad was supporting in this movement want to completely eliminate the police.
Okay, got it.
Right. And so I think it was like a moment for my dad where he was like kind of jarred. And I think I see this a lot, where like people grapple onto a certain idea and then portray it in their own mind as they want to see it, and then project that idea out to everyone else as what they must think as well, because they came to a logical conclusion in their mind. So they assume that everyone else will come to the same logical conclusion. But I think it was like a kind of turnaround moment for him, where he realized like, hey, like maybe this isn't like as clear as I thought it was, or maybe this isn't exactly what the movement I thought I was supporting and stuff like that. It was an interesting moment of clarity. But in terms, you know, my point being is that, from your question, my dad definitely was a little bit upset at me in that moment for holding my opinion, although I didn't have really radical opinion at all. I was just asking the question of like, is this the right move or not? And like just asking that already got him a little bit upset. I've tried to avoid political conversation with my family since that point. Outside of my mom, because my mom and I think in similar ways. But yeah, I mean, there's definitely been some stuff I've talked about in regards to the police topic specifically with other people, like maybe in passive conversation at a bar, right, where I can see them getting upset, and I've usually throttled back on my opinion because my intent is not to create a scene at a kava bar. but I've seen other people get upset at other people. I've watched in-person conversations where someone gets super mad at someone and walks away or storms away. But I guess I've traditionally avoided topics that I think would be decisive, because unless there are with people that I know I can have a productive conversation with, because otherwise I just don't see it going well and bettering either of our perspectives or mindset or place.
Yeah.
But what about you?
My entire introduction to politics was like that, because I had always, as a kid, my view of politics was it's just people disagreeing on TV. That's all it was. My grandmother, when she would visit Florida, she was like heavier set and didn't like leaving the bedroom really. She just liked to lay in bed and watch Fox News. So she would lay in bed and watch Fox News. And sometimes I would spend quality time with her by also watching Fox News with her. And it was just people like yelling at each other for hours. And I was like, this isn't interesting to me, because I just generally don't like people yelling at each other.
Yeah.
So I never learned. And at one point, my girlfriend in college, her parents were teachers in elementary school or a high school. And her dad was the AP US history teacher. And her sister's fiance was a political science major in college. And he really loved politics and all that shit. And so when the 2020 election was coming up, this was in 2019, she was like, oh, let's go to, his name is David, the poli-sci major. She was like, let's go to David's and figure out with him who you're going to vote for in this election. And I was like, I don't know if I want to vote. I don't really care. I've heard it doesn't count. And she was like, it does count, and you should do it. And I was like, okay, that's fair. Fine. I should figure out, if I'm going to vote, I want to be an informed voter. So I went to David's, and
that's something that a lot of people don't understand. Sorry to interrupt you, but
no, go for it.
There are so many people out there that are ill-informed voters that still go out and vote for people that they completely do not understand the policies on. And that to me is terrifying.
Yeah.
Like, if I'm going to put myself into something, I want to at least make sure I have a baseline education about the topic and about like what each side says before I go and like make the really important decision of electing, especially someone who's going to be president for the next 4 years. Like,
right.
It's wild to me that so many people will go out and vote based off of like an advertisement they saw.
Yeah, it's vibes.
Yeah, joy. It's so crazy to me that people will go out and vote on that and not even look at policies or not read anything other than like just trusting someone on TikTok and whatever propaganda they have. It's very scary to me.
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry to interrupt your story.
Yeah. But political campaigns use vibes, right? Because vibes is what gets people out to vote. You just have to have policy to back it up, right? Usually. But the two big issues that I have,
the real kicker is to not post your policy for 2 months and then this
just go off only
vibes so that people don't have time to really debate and dig into your policies. And then when you do release them, they're arbitrary and don't make sense and contradict your past political views. That's a real power move. Anyway,
people will vote people will either not vote at all because they don't think that their vote counts, which I believed for a while before finding out that wasn't true. Your vote does count, but just maybe not as much as someone in a different state.
You should at least vote for the amendments locally. Like, some of those can come down to the thousands.
Sure, yeah. I mean, sometimes, like, even the 2020 election came down to the thousands.
Yeah, but like, especially, I'm saying like in local elections, like in your county elections.
Yeah.
Like, you definitely vote, at least for your county elections, if you don't care about the president. Like, your vote really can stand out in those.
Well, and in the local elections, it only comes down to within your state. There's not electoral college within the state. It's just strictly percentage, right? So like your vote always counts in your state, but even then it's not always, a straight fight, because in this election, I remember people were talking about Amendment 4 right now about abortion, because that needed over 60% to pass, which seems ridiculous, because it should be a majority rule. Like everything else is majority rule, right?
Sure.
The president doesn't need 60% of the votes to be elected, right? So even then, regardless of whether or not it's an even fight, like the electoral college or 60% to pass, your vote still does get counted and it still counts. And then uninformed voting, I would rather not vote than vote uninformed. That was my opinion up until 2020. And even for 2020, I was like, I don't know. It's June. The election's in November. I'm not going to have enough time to learn about what politics is, because at this point, I didn't know what Democrat or Republican meant. Like, I didn't know anything about politics at all. I didn't know that there were 3 branches of government. I didn't know that Congress was an entire one of them. Like, I didn't know fucking shit. So my girlfriend at the time got pissed at me and she was like, you took AP US history, the class that my dad teaches. I was like, huh? And she was like, and you did well on the AP exam. And I was like, I got a 5. I aced it. And she was like, and you don't know any of this shit? Zero memory retention. Because I learned it for the test and then immediately forgot it because I'd never used it. So we sat down with David, and he recognized that I was really uninformed right away. So he was like, the way we're going to do this is I'm going to give you a scenario, and then you're going to give me your opinion on the scenario, and then I'll tell you politically which way you lean, and based on that, what candidates align most with your values, right? So we're going to hit the major ones like immigration, economy, foreign policy, abortion, whatever, right? Because those are like the big issues that really divide between the two parties. And as we went through it, when I would agree with him on something, everybody in the room would nod their heads and they would be like, yeah, we agree because of X, Y, Z, and it makes sense. But when I would disagree, they would get heated like right away. And eventually I disagreed on enough things that my girlfriend and her sister literally left the room. They got up and left the room because they were so up in arms and like enraged and they needed to cool off. But David and I were able to sit and talk. And even when he would disagree on things, he would be like, okay, I think we just have different views on this, but based on your response, you lean this way or that way. And that was really helpful for me because that was the first calm, rational conversation I had had in politics. And to this day, it's one of my favorite ones because he's one of the only people I've found who is okay with disagreeing. Like you could have a conversation, he doesn't want to try to convince you and he's not looking to be convinced by you. You just speak about the topic. But I remember after that, ultimately I decided to vote for Trump in that election. And I remember that my girlfriend and I had been like talking offhandedly about politics after that conversation, just having like, you know, generic discussions, like vagaries. Yeah. And I remember we were driving to a house party and we were in the parking lot about to get out of the car. And we were talking about the election and like we were in agreement on this conversation. And then I was like, yeah, something, Trump. And she was like, wait, you're voting for Trump? And I was like, yeah. She was like, we've been having all these conversations and I thought you were talking about Biden. I was like, what are you talking about? Like, I think I've been pretty clear. I just haven't said his name. And she was like, I need to like reconsider. I was like, reconsider what? And she was like, dating you. And I was like, fucking what? We've been dating for like 5 years. Like, what are you talking about? And she was like, I just didn't know like you were like this. And I didn't know that you had these thoughts. I'm like, I'm the same person. You just have put a label on me now. But like ultimately we worked through it, but like never really. And it's interesting because in the last podcast I spoke about labels and how labels impact imposter syndrome and how generally I just don't like them. And I think this is one of the first instances where someone applied a label to me. Like I'm the same person I was a month and a half ago. It's just now that there's a label on me and you're passing assumptions on me. And it really shut me down, and it resulted in me caring way too much about politics for a while and then not caring enough about it. Because after that I was like, well, if people are going to get upset when I speak, then I just won't speak. And I had a friend who I agreed on everything politically with, and we had a great time together. But then I realized that we were just isolating ourselves from everyone else because no one's going to agree with everything with you on politics. There's always going to be some difference and some disagreement. And I don't want that to be a reason I don't hang out with someone.
Yeah. It's I think actually a difference between us that I think has contributed to maybe me having less confrontational conversations or like, you know, outwardly confrontational conversations than you have is for a long period of time, I tried to assimilate myself to the people that I was around in order to ease the conversation up and to ease, you know, just the general communication and whoever I was hanging out with.
Yeah.
And I think that you've had less of that over, you know, the past years of your life. And so I think that's probably contributed to the lack of confrontation that I've seen personally in my own life. But I anticipate that as I go down the path that I'm going down now, which is very similar to yours and kind of just like standing my ground and trying to have constructive conversation and we don't have to agree on everything, I will probably run into that more in the future. I anticipate, or potentially. The potential is higher for me to run into a confrontational conversation in the future because I don't have this drive or urge to assimilate to the people I am with. I just kind of speak my mind, and then if they disagree, that's cool. But
yeah,
you know, and then if we agree, that's cool too.
Yeah. Ultimately, I think it's best when someone asks you your opinion, because then you're answering a question, and if they want to know more, they can ask more, and then they're asking about how you feel instead of you having a conversation with the intent of sharing your own opinion on it, right? So whenever I have like contentious conversations with people, usually I'll be the one asking the questions. And like, I don't really reveal my hand, because if I disagree, I know I'm okay with it. And I'm not interrogating you. I'm just want to know more where you're at. It's the conversation that we're having. And then if that person is curious in how I stand, I'll allow them to ask the questions that they want to ask. It's kind of like I'm an open book. You can decide if you want to come up and read it or not. I'm not going to force you.
There was a great podcast hosted by the Daily Wire, specifically Jordan Peterson, available on YouTube, between Jordan Peterson and Destiny. And Destiny is he's a progressive left-wing commentator who streams video games, but has also gotten into political commentary as of the past few years, if I remember correctly. And Jordan Peterson is a philosophical thinker, graduated with his degree in psychology in Canada, but I don't remember what college. Anyways, it doesn't really matter. He's a conservative commentator, or even more like classical liberal to conservative commentator, and they have a debate about various issues that were coming into this election. Obviously, the election is over, but nevertheless, it is very interesting to watch them debate about the two topics. And I enjoyed the conversation a lot. I thought there were a lot of interesting points brought up, and it was one of, I feel like, the few times that I've seen really good long-form conversation between two people that hold completely different views about almost every topic. Like, I feel like a lot of the time, like you've seen the Jubilee or Tubilee podcast where it's like one Democrat versus 25 Republicans and then vice versa. Like, I feel a lot of those are like very quick and they're entertaining, but there isn't really a lot of substance that comes out of them, at least most of the time. And then occasionally it also just gets into a yelling match, and it's like, what's the real like point here?
Right.
And like, also, usually it's just a bunch of young adults in their 20s, you know, with the occasional older person thrown in on either side. But I take more value from people who have had more time to mature their opinion. Like, I wouldn't go into a conversation with Destiny or Jordan Peterson and feel as though I had like 100% the backing to defend my position. I think I have a lot of good evidence to defend my position. And I think I've done a lot of research, but like, I still feel internally as though I need more time to mature my perspectives and more research. And I think, you know, the point I'm making is that the conversation between Destiny and Jordan Peterson was two people who have very well developed their opinion over more than 2.5 years, which has been how long I've been developing mine. And so I really value that conversation. I thought it was really interesting to hear them move out. And they're also very philosophical. So I guess that's a plug for the Daily Wire on YouTube. But yeah, check out that podcast. It's really interesting to listen to. But
cool. That's what I have for my introduction.
Yeah. Do you want to dive in? What does it mean to disagree with someone?
Yeah.
Awesome.
Okay, so I have a definition here. To disagree is to have or express a different opinion or belief from someone else. To fail to concur or be in harmony with another person's viewpoint, decision, or statement. Disagreement often involves a divergence in ideas, values, or preferences, and does not imply hostility. So in essence, a state of disagreement, it's like a state of being, right? So in the state of disagreement, it literally means you're in a state in which your belief is not exactly identical to someone else's. And critically there, nowhere in the definition does it say you hate the other person because they think differently. It's just you are in a different state of understanding, right?
Yeah.
What's your definition?
So I kind of defined it between 3 different core attributes of disagreement.
Okay.
So the first one is you have to have a difference in opinion regarding facts, values, preferences, or implications of an event, and then et cetera, on the similar line of thinking. For example, you could have a disagreement of fact based on how many illegal migrants you think have crossed the border over the past 4 years. You could say 6.5 million, which is the federal numbers right now, or you can go with Trump's, exaggerated estimate of 20 million potentially. We don't really know, right? And there's debate in the fact there. So it could be a disagreement or differences between facts, values, preferences, or implications of an event contribute or are a core factor of disagreement. One of them. The second being is a cognitive separation that stems from the different ways of interpreting data surrounding certain inputs regarding personal experiences, anecdotes, culture, etc. For example, with the same illegal migrant thing where we talked about 6.5 million versus 20 million, what are the facts there? You could also say, is it good for our country to have illegal migrants crossing the southern border, or is it bad for our country, right? That would be disagreement stemming from cognitive separation about the different ways to interpret the facts surrounding a certain issue. And then thirdly, I think this is going to be important in getting at how do you disagree with someone without hating that person, is emotional factors can mask the underlying agreement and logic in a situation. So, if you're disagreeing with someone and you have a contradiction of fact, and you also have a contradiction in regards to the interpretation or effect of the different facts that you're looking at, you can emotionally get into a state where you mask an underlying agreement that you could get to, but you're so worked up that, this is kind of like a heightened level of disagreement where it's just like a complete separation between two. For example, with the illegal migrant case again, illegal migration is the number one issue versus illegal migration is not really that big of an issue, right? That could be kind of like an emotional standpoint, where maybe there's a potential to find a middle ground there, but if you're so divisive already, you might just fight about that one fact. Although there's two things that you're both saying that they're an issue, but it's just a differentiation of like how important is it in comparison to other issues like maybe the economy or foreign affairs or whatever. So emotional factors override opinion based on cognitive differences, and they can lead to the weakening of a relationship and diminished cognitive growth and development. So, essentially what I'm trying to say is that disagreement is a contradiction between fact. It can be a contradiction between how those facts are interpreted, and then it can also be fueled by emotional factors that mask the logic and reason within that you could come to through a like debate or a conversation, right?
Confrontation.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So that is, what does it mean to disagree with someone? That's what I threw down for that. Do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I've got a couple more things. I just want to let you run.
I ran with my part.
Yeah. No, I think it's a good statement. Deciphering the difference between your perceived state of importance. So like, how important is this object to me versus do you disagree on a fact? Because it's really difficult to disagree on what color my race helmet is, because we can both see that it's black, right? But it's really challenging.
It's matte black.
There you go. It's challenging when you take a number like how many illegal immigrants have come into the country, because that's in itself kind of like an oxymoron, because if you're tracking the illegal migrants coming in, shouldn't you also be like, you're tracking them because you're stopping them from coming in, right? Like, you don't have a motion detector set up along the entire border that detects every time someone crosses in what direction they're going, right? You're only tracking the number of people that you have eyes on coming through the border or have like dog tagged, right?
Well, there's also a question of how many, so the numbers from the federal government come from the amount of encounters at the southern border,
right?
But it's a question of how many of those people are allowed to come through based on like a refugee status or like a looking for a better life argument, right, versus how many people are turned away. We don't know, but then we also don't know how many people cross over that Border Patrol agents do not encounter at all. So like there's a easy disagreement of fact there.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, it's unclear, and that's really tricky because in itself, in the definition of how many illegal migrants have come into the country, there is a state of uncertainty there, because if you knew exactly, then there wouldn't be the issue, right? So it invites uncertainty.
Yeah.
But there are other examples that I've had conversations with where there's less uncertainty and it's more on vibes. So I've had conversations with people that talk about the percentage of crime committed in America between black people and white people, because there's far more crime reportedly committed by black people. However, I've had conversations with people who say, well, I know 10 people, white people, who have been pulled over for speeding, but then let go without a ticket. And that doesn't go into a crime record. But every black person I know going the same speed has been pulled over, has gotten a ticket. And that sways the crime statistics. And that is not backed by evidence largely. It's backed by firsthand accounts, but it wouldn't show up in the data. So it's that is an example on vibes where there shouldn't be any vibes. And then the illegal migrants it's difficult to decide what is fact and what isn't, and then if it's true or if it's false.
Yeah, well, there is also some data to suggest that African-American people tend to get higher sentences for the same crimes as white people, but then there's also like that sort of data makes me nervous, because it's like, how is the crime the same versus like what's not being disclosed that is different, right? Because either it's like we have this massive racial injustice and systemic racism in all of our judicial system and all of our police and everything that's federal, right, in that sense. Or we maybe have a little bit of that individually through just bad people in a good system, and then those individuals are taken and then used to sway data in a certain way. You know, it's like kind of a different example, but similar example is we saw the crime statistics edited after the debate between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, so the crime statistics from the federal government showed that crime was actually down over the Biden administration. But what they didn't disclose is that they excluded a lot of cities like Detroit or San Francisco or Los Angeles where crime has risen tremendously. So they disclosed those cities from the overall calculation. And then they very quietly reintroduced those cities and those numbers to show that crime had gone up by over 20%. Right. And so like you get this manipulation of fact that can be very frightening, and it's easy to when the facts are misconstrued in certain ways, it makes me nervous, and it makes disagreement a lot easier too, because it's like when you're trying to pull information to, you know, have a constructive argument constructive conversation, and you're coming up with numbers that are not factually correct and do not reflect what we've actually seen in society, it makes it worrisome.
Right. I mean, and I think amongst people who've been to college specifically, you have a better understanding that the data isn't always accurate. It's not always reflective. So when you're looking at a study, if you haven't read through the entire details of the study, it would be foolish to just trust the information that's presented because you need to know how it's presented. So like in physics lab, I remember several physics labs where you could have easily just presented the same data differently and gotten like a different data set entirely. Or there's something that's misleading. So for example, do you remember Dr. Sen's class where he was talking about relative motion in linkages and how there's a point on a wheel on a train that travels backwards? And it's because the rim of the wheels of the train dip below the tracks, and the relative motion is in reverse of the direction of the train, right? That's like, if I went up to someone and I was like, hey, what point of a wheel on a train moves backwards? That's ridiculous, right? It's preposterous, but it's true because it's relative. So when you're looking at data, it makes it so much more challenging to have a logical conversation because irrelevant of your emotion about it, like how you care, how important it is, etc. Just trying to figure out what data is accurate is a challenge in itself.
A really interesting one that I looked into the other day was the national debt and deficit increase over the past 4 years. When you look it up on Google, the national debt is shown to have, the national deficit has shown, deficit.
That's the same.
No, they're different. They're a little bit different.
Deficit?
Debt is like total money owed, and then deficit is the difference between the amount of revenue you collect versus the debt that you're accumulating. So if you have a debt that accumulates by $7 billion a year, but you collect $5 billion from the taxpayers every year, then your deficit would be $2 billion in that case, right?
Got it.
But I said billion, but in reality it's trillions. But
sure.
The point is there. Anyways, when you look up the deficit change between Trump and Biden administrations from 2016 to 2020 versus 2020 to 2024, the Biden administration looks to have had a lower deficit over the past 4 years than the Trump administration. But those statistics are pulled from one individual website. It's like the honest regulation of federal money. It's like some weird website like that. But those statistics are the first result on Google. And it makes Trump look like 9 million of spending, 9 trillion spending, 4 billion due to COVID. And then Biden was 4 billion of trillion of traditional spending, and then 2 trillion that was COVID related and something like that. And once you dig into those statistics actually exclude a lot of executive orders that were put in place that cost billions of dollars. They have they completely negate the fact that a majority of the COVID relief money actually did not go to COVID relief under the Biden administration. Only 10% of it went to COVID relief related tasks and, amendments, stuff like that. But when the data is manipulated and you don't understand where the data come from and it doesn't seem to reflect the world around you, it's a very interesting path to go down. And it makes it hard to have good debate because, when you have to dig into that sort of stuff, it almost makes you look like a conspiracy theorist, but it's like...
Well, it's not a state of conspiracy. It's a state of clarity, because you and I can sit down at a table to discuss government spending. And I can have a report that says that the government actually only lost $25 last year. And you can have one that says it lost 25 trillion. And we're both wrong. The government does not know how many government agencies there are. The government has actually audited itself to try to become more efficient. And it cannot determine with exact certainty how many government departments there are. The DOD has been audited countless times, and they have never been able, the government cannot track down to the penny how much money has actually been used by the military. So when the government allocates $42 billion this year for the military, the government really only knows where like maybe half of that goes. The other half goes into the ether, right? There have been instances where people find that, a government contractor is charging $3,000 for like a wing nut that really only costs 28 cents, right? I'm sure you've heard of that one. There are instances there of overspending, but regardless of those instances, on the macro scale, they don't know where a lot of it goes. So if the government doesn't know where the government spending is, independent studies definitely aren't going to know. And then no one's data is accurate, and then it's all speculation. But I feel that ultimately what the disagreements come down to is what you feel every day, right? Because the government is very big macro. There are two different scales of disagreement. There's what's your favorite kind of fruit disagreement. You might say apples, I might say bananas, and I might be right because bananas are better, right? That's a small scale disagreement. And then there's a large scale disagreement of like, do you think we should be sending money to Ukraine? And that's such a macro issue with so many more variables that are unknown. It's kind of like, do you remember when we were in PDE and they were like, if you have 47 unknown variables and 3 that you do know, then you can work the problem out. Yeah. It takes a lot of fucking time, but eventually you can get there. I feel like with macro scale issues like that, there are 470 trillion unknown variables and 11 of them. Like, you're not going to be able to work that problem out. Ultimately, I feel that most people vote based on their perception. So you could do the long calculus of, okay, well, Joe Biden wanted to stop the Keystone Pipeline because it wasn't good for the Native Americans and XYZ and that, this and that, and it was good for the Americans. But then Russia invaded Ukraine, which means that we had to stop buying oil from them, which means the oil price in Dubai went up, meaning we have to spend more at the gas pump. But that's not really within our control, except maybe it is because Trump's foreign policy was... There's so many variables. Ultimately, the fallout of that is we spend more at the gas pump. So I feel like most people will disagree on the small scale, which is I pay more at the gas pump. Bananas are better than apples. And you can escalate that conversation up, but the further up you get, the more unknown variables you run into.
Yeah. But at the same time, you do get more information to potentially prove your claim or disprove your claim.
Yeah. Right. And I feel almost is that the larger scale you get, for every point of information that goes your way, there's like 7 more that are undecided that crop up. Right. Yeah. So like the Keystone Pipeline, there's a lot of reasons that Joe Biden thought was good to do it. And then there were unseen ramifications because of a weakness in a different area. Right. And then you open up and now a debate about the economy with the oil prices now turns into a debate about foreign policy because it had to do with Russia. Everything's kind of like intermingled with one another.
Yeah.
But ultimately, people are in a state of disagreement all the time. If everyone were in a state of agreement, then it's just a world full of identical people who think exactly the same. And that's pretty much communism, right? I think everyone can get on board with communism's bad, but it's a clone world of everyone who's exactly identical. And no one wants that.
Yeah. I think that's a utopia that would never happen, but also it
sounds like hell to me.
It's important. So this is actually one of the things about free speech that I think is really important. Like, there has been a small push from the left to kind of like censor stuff like hate speech, to kind of have like censored speech, or to have speech that goes in alignment with like a certain train of thought and stuff like that. And I think that's really scary for a number of reasons. When when you try to force everyone into agreement and try to get everyone to stop thinking about what they're saying, or at least make that perception available online through censorship, like you get to a point where you lose the ability to think critically, right? And you also lose the ability to like develop as a person. I think like when you only have the opportunity to see stuff that aligns with exactly what your opinion is, I think that is a real hindrance on someone's development. Like I think I've grown a lot from disagreeing with someone and then researching it and either affirming my belief or changing my belief.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And like the only counter to bad speech is better speech.
Right. But especially with free speech, it's like, does it bother you if I think that bananas are better than apples?
No.
So then why should what I say bother you either?
Yeah.
Like, does it bother you when you disagree with people on mundane things? Like, if I think we should get seafood and you think we should get American food, does that bother you very much, right? So if you take that to a macro scale, and I think that I don't know, pick something crazy. I think that Elon Musk should be put under like really strict government regulations to stop people from saying the N-word on Twitter. Right? It doesn't bother me that you want to get American food and I want to get sushi. It doesn't bother me if you want Elon Musk to be put under restrictions or not. I think differently, right? Because I agree with you that free speech is important and you should be able to disagree with other people. But ultimately, I am not bothered by being in a state of disagreement with other people. And I feel like with other people, they fail to realize that to them, free speech is just so much more important than bananas or apples. But for me, bananas or apples are just as important as free speech.
I think free speech is much more important. Like I get much more invested in talking about things that I think affect a broad range of people than I do about things that I think affect little to no people.
I think it affects the same amount of people.
Why would you preferring bananas over apples affect the same amount of people as censoring media content regarding free speech?
Because every person is impacted by the speech amendments, right? And every person is impacted by apples and bananas.
But
it's more important to you, but it impacts everybody. You see what I mean?
No, not quite. I mean, like if we were to change laws around regarding free speech and censorship, that would affect every single person in the United States.
Laws are kind of different, right?
But laws stem from
restrictions
from ideas. Right?
Okay, so in this case, it would be restricting the availability of apples for banana eaters versus restricting the availability of free speech for non-free speechers, right? Thinking conceptually and less about like actual regulation that places restrictions on people. Free speech is maybe not a great one. It's more about the concept behind it than actual regulations, right?
I guess so, but I think there are more important. Like there are certain topics that have more weight to them and therefore are more important to discuss and debate.
To most people there are. Most people have a hierarchy of importance.
Right.
And I don't have that. Okay. I think they're all equally important to everybody because everyone has a right to think whatever they want to be. No, not at all. It's anti-communist. It's the opposite of communism because I think everybody should have their opinion on everything and it's equally important to them. So like the way I feel about slavery is equally important to how I feel about apples versus bananas because it's all in my head. It's all subjective.
I guess so. But then, I mean, I understand what you're trying to say. I think I disagree because there are, to say that everything is subjective based on everyone's perception of it eliminates like standard hierarchy of values.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's one thing to like, I think traditionally, like, do you have a hierarchy of things that you find more valuable than other things?
I think if you gave me an ultimatum, one versus the other, I would probably end up with one, but that's not the way that my head works. And that's not the way the world usually works. So like when given the choice between eating sushi or burgers tonight, I give that the same amount of critical thought as I do to like major political issues that most people like abortion. Right.
Okay. So you wouldn't like if you, well, I feel like, I don't know. I feel like if we had a political disagreement, you would spend more time trying to look that up than if I said I wanted to get Chinese food and you said you wanted to get American food. And then, like, I don't know if there would be any incentive to look up the differences between American and Chinese food and try to figure out which one is better. But there may be incentive to say, like, if I said, I think that Trump's border policy is going to make our economy worse. Like, there is more incentive to look up something in regards to that, because I feel like there is an inherent larger value to that. More
there's a key word in that, which was better. Which is
better about what?
Which you were saying, which is better, American food.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Right. And I don't think that there is a true version of better. I don't think that there is an inherent right or wrong. I think that it's different for everybody. And it changes from century to century and era to era. And that's a really unpopular opinion, because a lot of people...
It's unpopular. It's just different.
It's super unpopular. Really? Because I will say that today, based on the majority of values today, slavery is considered to be wrong, because the majority of people think it's wrong. But there was a world hundreds of years ago where most people did not agree with that. Most people thought slavery was right. And in that era, slavery was right. What changed? The opinions of the majority of people. That didn't really change whether it was right or wrong. That just changed the mass opinion of it, right? Because right or wrong is entirely
right
subjective.
And wrong is dictated by the populist consensus.
Yeah.
But I mean, if you that puts a real strain on, like, if you have a small subset group that is living in a communist society, in the communist society, the populace obviously has a certain perspective, but, let's say everyone should have equal income, right? And that's regardless of their line of work. And that's like the populist consensus, but that doesn't, I don't think that really necessarily makes it right, because there are certain people who work harder than others and should be compensated for that.
Yeah, that's your version of right, but not theirs. See what
right.
Like,
But
you have a lot of data to support your claim,
sure,
and they'll have a lot of data to support their claim. But in the end, right is subjective. Like correctness and good versus evil is entirely subjective.
I don't know if it is. It's a good question.
It's kind of like the free will discussion.
How so?
It's kind of like the free will discussion in that most people think they have free will, but like your study the other week where you were talking about how scientifically, really you don't. It's a conceptual discussion about people's perceptions of their own actions and their own thoughts. It's very introspective. But my introspective conception is that right and wrong are entirely subjective. And everything that I have, because I have opinions, right? I think slavery is wrong. I think abortion's okay. Sure. Because I have data that supports my emotions about it. But that doesn't mean that people who think slavery is right or abortion is wrong are wrong about those opinions. They definitely won't fit in here, right? Because I won't accept that, because that's not the way that I think. But I still think that they have a right to that opinion, even though I don't agree with them.
Yeah.
So if I disagree with that person...
I would agree with that, but I don't know. I don't see how that supports... yes, I agree that they have a right to that different opinion, but I don't know how that supports the idea that all opinions are about all topics are also weighted equally, or there is a subjective right and wrong. Like, I think there is, in many cases, a clear right and wrong. I think it's a sliding scale, but like there are some things that are clearly wrong, and to say that those things that are clearly wrong, if they happen to get into the populace's opinion, suddenly they become right, I think is a scary thought, because I think there is there's a wide path of stuff that we can go down and vary within that path. But once we go to the outskirts, even if they become popular outskirts, they diverge from a path that is psychologically at a base level better for humanity and better for people.
I think that religion is a great example of that. Religion is a great example of determining clear right and wrongs for people to follow, to prosper, right? But someone decided that one day and decided that it was the best. Before that, there wasn't. And even since then, like people have disagreements with the guidelines set by.
Well, I think there's always been clear right or wrongs. Like, if I were to go murder my neighbor 100,000 years ago, I without incentive, like I just woke up one day, I was like, I just want to kill someone, and I went and killed my neighbor, like that. I think that would be clearly a wrong thing to do.
Monkeys do it all the time.
Yeah.
And then that monkey's respected for it.
I mean, I'd say that we have more critical thought and consciousness than a monkey does, though.
What is critical thought?
The ability to analyze a situation based on different factors to come to a conclusion.
Right. Which informs our perception of right and wrong, right?
Yeah.
But the monkeys don't have that. And the octopi, which think differently, don't have that. They have it differently.
I mean, I'd argue they do because even specifically to the monkey example, this is kind of niche. So I don't want to make this sound like I'm poking at data. But with the monkey example, there is the leader chimp, I'll take chimps because this is actually specifically related to chimps. The leader chimp, like the main guy, is not necessarily like the strongest or the most powerful. It's the one with the most network. And I think that, to build a network effectively, there are certain rights or wrongs that you do in order to create that connection, and to create that. I don't know.
But that's monkey right and wrong, right? And monkey right and wrong is different from people right and wrong. And we could argue that we have critical thinking skills and monkeys don't, so people's right are better than monkeys' right. But it's also biased by the fact that we're people, right?
Yeah.
So right and wrong.
I mean, does your okay? I guess I'm making the distinction that animals, we are something more than animals, right? I think that might be a differentiation between us.
I think we're something different than animals. I don't think
you do.
Yeah, I think we're different than animals.
I think we are something different and more intellectually capable. I think. I see your point. I see your point in that. How do we know their intellectual capability and how do we know their perception of their intellectual capability? Like, I see your point. It's interesting. I have to think about it. I don't have a good,
right.
I haven't mulled over this enough to really make a concrete.
And that's what I mean to say. It's not a popular opinion.
Inherently, I feel as though there is right and wrong, but I understand the subjective perception of what is right and wrong as well. So I'll think about this. This is interesting.
Yeah. I feel that people are generally looking for a clear right and wrong, but disagreement or the state of disagreement is largely stemmed by the foundation of right and wrong. And if people disagree, then that means your right is different than someone else's right, and your wrong is different than someone else's wrong. And I think that each of you are correct. And therefore, I'm not bothered when someone else disagrees with me because their version of right is different than mine. Now, when it comes to laws, the majority of people have determined that murdering your neighbor who hasn't done anything wrong is wrong, right? So if you were to do that, you would be put in prison.
Right.
But in monkey tribes or Neanderthal tribes or the uncontacted tribes today in the Amazon, that might not be the same way. And it's because they have a different perception of what's right. So if someone believes that bananas are tastier than apples is right, fine. And if someone believes that abortion is wrong and murder is right, fine. I disagree, but it doesn't matter because you have the right to that.
Interesting. So I wanted to touch on quickly. We took a small pause, and I looked up the debt stuff that I was talking, debt and deficit stuff I was talking about earlier. I kind of botched the numbers around a little bit. I didn't want to sound ill-informed, although I knew the concept I was talking about. I just couldn't remember the exact numbers.
You read real good, but can't remember a whole lot.
Yeah. Well, I can remember well once it's repeated to me a few times, but when I just look at something like once or twice in passing while talking with someone else, sometimes it doesn't sink in fully. And then once I get into a debate conversation, I realize that it didn't sink in as much as I thought it was. So I just wanted to clarify this up so that we stay, reputable and educated, and I'm not, spewing stuff that's untrue. The committee...
For clarity, I'm not reputable and I'm uneducated. Now go.
I try to be as reputable as I can. So the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget claims that the federal debt under Trump grew by 7.2 trillion and by 6 trillion under Biden, right? Additionally, this is a point that I made a little bit earlier, but debt and deficit are a little bit different. Deficit is like the effective debt essentially because it counts for interest increases over time and our ability to pay it back. So deficit is directly correlated to like how much money are we bringing in versus the amount of debt we're accumulating. So the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget negates that, and their claim is that the debt is higher under Trump than it was under Biden. First off, that's factually not true. So they excluded approximately $0.8 trillion from that estimate in executive actions that Biden made. They excluded a bunch of different legislation pieces that would have added to the debt. But then on top of that, the deficit is the important part because that's how much we're actually going to be paying. But the Biden administration has increased the deficit by $11.6 trillion, whereas during the Trump administration, whereas on the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget, they claimed that it was only $4.3 trillion in deficit increase because they're not actually projecting out the interest rates that will occur due to the increased debt and decreased amount of money that we're getting in order to pay that debt off in the country. Mm-hmm. So just a few tidbits. It's a good article. It's called Fact Check Alert, Debunking CRFB's Analysis of Trump and Biden Impacts on the National Debt. And it's brought to you by the, I'm trying to read the small print, the Federal Budget Committee. So, it's a good article. I just want to clarify that up because I botched some of the numbers, but the point we were making at that time was that sometimes data can be manipulated in ways that you cannot see superficially. And so, there is disagreement that can easily stem from just facts.
Yep. Let me do it live and in action. The debt, the U.S. debt, is higher than it's ever been right now, right? Do you know the reason that it's the highest it's ever been right now?
Well, because we spend more.
No, it's because we're in the longest peacetime in our nation's history. Because usually a country will get into debt and then bomb other countries, and then the debt goes away because they bombed them. They just fucking went to war and nuked them all, right? And to their credit, Joe Biden has tried to get into as many wars as he could, which would have...
I got you now. Yeah.
It's bullshit, but it is kind of interesting because it's like, well, a fucking short-sighted way of looking at it is the larger your national debt is, the better you are at keeping peace, but it's not actually the case. I just thought it was funny.
Yeah, no, that is, I see your point.
So that's what I have on the definition of what does it mean to disagree and my introspective rant on the difference between right and wrong. Do you have anything else?
That was everything I had and much more than I anticipated. So awesome. I think I'm ready to move to section 2.
Cool. So the second section is on why do people disagree so aggressively? I frequently witness people faced with disagreement collapse in on themselves like a dying star. They become enraged and endlessly frustrated at the fact that others do not agree with them. Props to Sander for not doing that 20 minutes ago. I have a speculation on this. Say person A holds a position and appeals that position to person B. Person B holds a different position. Person A takes that to mean that person B thinks person A is an idiot for holding that position and that person A is wrong and too stupid to see it. Person A is not able to recognize that person B might not care what person A thinks and that each person is within their right to view the world through their own lens. Person A, now enraged at you for raising these points, loots the local Target, lights it on fire, and puts a defund the police sticker on their car before driving away from you as fast as possible. So that's a bit extreme, but the central messaging here is people view disagreement as a personal slight and imply a judgment against themselves, but projecting that onto the person you're talking to against themselves. And I think that we'll get into how to not be such an ass later, but I think that the core fundamental piece of disagreeing with hatred is not understanding that there is not always a judgment applied. It's just being in a different state of being. Mm-hmm. What do you have?
Yeah. I have 3 points to break this one down. The first being is that I think people aggressively disagree, firstly because of primitive psychological and emotional protection for their own identity or how they see themselves. A lot of people need validation of their opinion, that when their opinion is rooted in their cognitive biases, and that validation, seeking that validation, when it's met with disagreement, they seek a very primate style or primitive way to defend themselves from the impact that it would have on their own personal identity. Mm-hmm. That also gets to another point where it's like your opinions, people have trouble separating one's opinions from like the person that they actually are. Mm-hmm. And so it's like when someone attacks one's opinions, it feels though it's attack on like who they are as a person.
Right.
Whereas like that's not necessarily the case, or in many cases is not.
Yeah.
And then aggression in that sense is a form of protection, right? Additionally, I think people fear social backlash when they're in disagreement. Like if they disagree about something and they start to feel like they're being proved wrong, they feel as though society will ostracize them because they got something wrong and they made a mistake and blah, blah, blah. And so there's a fear of your social bubble bursting when you are losing a debate or you feel like you're losing in a conversation per se, and you can't defend your position through fact, so you defend it through more primitive means. Even if you could defend it through fact, if you had more knowledge and your opinion was right to start, but you just couldn't defend it effectively, there's this idea that like as soon as you feel like you are being outmatched in a conversation or debate, that you have to defend yourself by any means necessary, and so then you just get aggressive and upset to try and just smother out the other person. Additionally, I think something that fuels angry disagreement in our country is media influence and propaganda in general. I've seen a lot of rhetoric on both sides of the aisle that fuels up, either the right or the left to feel a certain way about an issue. And I think that kind of fueling raises emotional heights and raises your emotional temperature to where it's harder to think logically and critically in these conversations, which then leads to, a more aggressive take or in an aggressive situation during a debate or conversation.
So do you think it's stemmed in a fear of being wrong? You mentioned that in your second.
I think partially it can, because I think there is a fear of being wrong. I think a lot of people have this psychology, this like weird psychological train where they think because they disagreed with this one person, they're going to be ostracized from society, and then no one will like them, and no one will like them forever, so then they're going to die alone, right? Like there's this like train of thought, like jumping, where people think because of this one instance that I have to protect with everything I have, because otherwise if I'm wrong in this one situation, I'm just going to die alone and it'll be all sad and gloomy for the rest of my life. Like I think there is an aspect to that.
Are you afraid of dying alone?
No, I don't really think about it much.
If you thought about it, do you think you would care?
Probably not.
I think that the fear of being wrong is a really great way of putting it, and it really clarifies the reason that I don't really get upset when I disagree with people or when people disagree with me, because my concept of right and wrong, as we just talked about, is really introspective and fucking nutty. So being wrong doesn't mean anything to me, because my wrong is different from your wrong. So even if it's factual, right? Even if you've got all these studies that lay out a point and you're like, look, all of the data trends towards this direction, I am happy to say I just don't buy it. I just don't like it. It's just not for me.
Isn't that just like a lack of self-reflection though? Like how is that not a lack of self-reflection?
In what sense?
Like I feel like if I were to present a bunch of data about why apples are better than bananas, but you still think bananas are better than apples, but I present like a wealth of data to show that like apples are better for your health.
They stimulate more taste buds.
They stimulate more taste buds, and they help with cognitive ability, and they help more with your eyesight, whatever, right? Blah, 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 right? I don't know a lot about apples. I'm making stuff up. But
that's okay.
If I were to present that to you, and then you were to still disagree that apples are better than bananas, isn't that a lack of like critical thinking about the data or like self-reflection about your position?
It could be. If it's a scientific thing, if it's so in that instance, I would be happy to agree with you that it is far more likely that more people enjoy apples because they stimulate more taste buds, it's healthier, everything that you just mentioned, right? But the fact that it influences more people positively does not mean that it influences me more positively, because my experience with apples is different. So if we're talking about like, it's difficult with science and like a physical, like gravity, right? Because you can't really argue with that. It's kind of the science of how it works. But when we're talking about like large numerical models and trends in society and things, it's more of a belief structure than a data structure, because it's predictions, right? And I had this realization about belief when I went through a really bad breakup, because I went to a church just to try to like find a lesson to think about, like a life lesson, a moral to consider. And I walked away with this realization that religion is based around belief. And you can't change that. Like, it might change over time, but you can't force yourself into it. Like, you can't force yourself to start believing in something that you don't. And love works the same way. You can't force yourself to start loving someone if you don't love them. And you can't stop yourself from loving someone if you do. Mm-hmm. It's an uncontrollable, that's the human experience to me. It's that uncontrollable emotion where you can cope with it, but if you have it, there's nothing you can do about it. And I feel like there's a little bit of that in every opinion that everybody has. And when it comes to something like apples and bananas, if I experience bananas as better than apples, I can't do anything about that. That's just the way that I experience it. But that's not to say that other people don't experience it differently. I'm happy to be the only person.
How do you go down the train of thought of changing your opinion based off of like do you ever change your opinion based off of like a debate someone has, or like if they bring up different political ideologies that you didn't realize that then change your opinion about something? Like, how do you go about reforming your opinion or growing if, at least superficially from what I'm understanding, maybe I'm not understanding clearly, it seems as though there's like a kind of like blanket statement of like, well, they might be right in their right, but I'm right in my right. Like, how do you come to the realization that you might be wrong in what you think is right, and therefore you will morph to feeling a new right is right?
In politics, it's usually about statistics.
Sure.
So statistically, what do I think is most likely to occur? But that's a prediction, right? So I might think it's more likely that if we, but it's kind of like saying, if you and I drive to the bar after this and we take the same route, but I run the red lights and you don't, it's likely that I am more likely to get in a car accident than you because I'm running red lights. That doesn't mean that it's going to happen. It just means it's more likely.
Right.
So the likelihood, I think, is where a lot of disagreements occur. Because I know that when I come up to a traffic light, I look both ways, regardless of what color the light is. So if it's red, I can control how fast I go through the light. I can go slowly and avoid the traffic. Or I could not look at all and just blow through it. And the difference is you're betting on other people to drive through the red lights. So you're betting on the likelihood of other people executing the task efficiently, where it's usually not likely to happen, right? Like with the whole immigration thing, you can set up a ton of different border policies, but whether or not they actually execute it properly is not a guarantee, right?
I guess it's not a guarantee, but there's I think there gets to a certain point where there's a certain level of probability that it becomes ill-informed to think that the opposite is the correct approach.
And that line is different for everybody. So everybody needs...
But that doesn't mean that the line still exists. So there is a right and a wrong.
No. Now it gets into gambling and betting, right? Because you can say there's a 99% likelihood that I get into a car accident if I run all the red lights, right? But for me to agree with that, I need it to be 99.999. And for other people, they might need a 5% and be like, that's too risky for me. Now it's a risk assessment. So to answer your question, for me personally, to change my opinion on a stance, I need, depending on the topic and how strongly I believe in it, I'll need a different amount of data to support it for me to change my position. So if I'm undecided on something, it doesn't take very much data one way or the other to give me an opinion. But if I'm really strongly rooted in one side of things, I'm going to need an overwhelming amount of data to combat all of those. So usually I don't enter conversations with the intention of changing my opinion. Usually I enter conversations to look at and try to understand the perspective of the person I'm speaking with, because that tells me more about that person and I can communicate more effectively with them. Sometimes that winds up in giving me enough information that I switch my opinion on something. But I don't really go out and look for it super often.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So I guess back to the main topic. Do you think that there has been a hike in the past decade of people disagreeing more aggressively? Like, I feel like if we look back to our parents talked about being friends like if they had liberal views, they'd be friends with conservatives and vice versa. But I feel like today you see a lot more polarization of people like just on the left or just on the right, or just with this certain point of view versus just that the other opposite point of view. And there doesn't seem to be a lot of threading between the different sides that, unless it is aggressive disagreement. Like there seems to be aggressive disagreement in the form of like protests that, you know, are just an angry mob or something like that.
Yeah.
But do you think that that is true, that as time has progressed, it seems as though the divide gets larger and larger and the only communication between the divide seems to be aggressive?
I think people like labels generally. So one of those labels, the LGBT movement is a big example of this, right? I think that it's become more prevalent that if somebody identifies with an LGBTQ label, they're more likely to include that in their Instagram bio than they would have been 15 years ago if they hadn't, right? Because it's a very quick and effective way to signal to people who are similar to you, hey, we have something in common. I think that hit a sweet spot maybe like 5 years ago where people were actually connecting based on it, maybe more than 5 years ago, because Jesus Christ, 5 years ago was 2019. Wow.
Yeah.
Maybe not then. That was a rough time. At some point, there must have been a sweet spot where
10 years ago.
Maybe 10 years ago.
I don't know. Yeah.
But at some point, there's a sweet spot where you could use labels in the internet to quickly find similarities with other people and make friends fast, right? The issue has come in, once you have your friends, you guys aren't really doing anything together because you guys can talk about the things you agree on all day long. But really what you want to talk about are the things that you disagree on. And there happens to be a polar opposite party over there, and they're all friends, and they have nothing else to talk about things except the things that they don't like. And so now we talk about each other, and we disagree, and we get upset and angry because that's all you have, really. It's really fucking unproductive. But I think so. Do you think that there hasn't been in the last 5 years?
No, I think there has been.
What are your thoughts?
I think it's been fueled a lot by polarizing media and polarizing rhetoric. I think that, but I think much more than that, even it's been fueled by the lack of critical thinking and the lack of valuing individual thought, and more so valuing social assimilation. So it's like I see a lot of people just will assimilate into certain groups because they agree about one thing. They'll assimilate to that entire group and adopt that entire actually, Destiny in the podcast I referred to earlier, Jordan Peterson put it as the constellation of ideas. So it's like they will assimilate to the constellation of ideas that this whole group has and adopt them and then take them as their own.
You did that.
Without...
You spoke about this earlier. You were like, when I lived up north, I kind of just like chameleoned into what everyone else was doing.
Yeah. I think that has gotten more common as of recently. I think that's partly to do with the fact that social media algorithms will statistically spread things that you interact with more, which tends to be things that you disagree with. You will interact with more. So social media algorithm are kind of rigged to show you stuff that will get you upset, which kind of adds fuel to the fire. There's these different extreme idea constellations that you can join that then you connect to, which have really extreme groups, which then make it hard to, I think critically when there's such a persuasive push to think a certain way. It's hard to step back and think critically, and then also risk the social ostracization of disagreeing, right? So I think that kind of like solidifies this one-sided view that seems to not be able to communicate with the other side, and vice versa, like either side you're on, whatever. I think overall, the introduction or the fueling of aggressive communication and debate in our society has had a negative impact on our ability to move forward and grow.
I think so, because nothing really positive comes from hatred, you know?
Right.
Like hatred really is just meant to tear people down and ideas down.
Yeah. It's kind of cool, actually. In addition to in regards to the Jordan Peterson and Destiny debate I watched, Jordan Peterson mentioned that like there were certain parts of the conversation that got relatively emotional. And it was interesting. He put it in its terms of like similar to the entropy of of our conversation as we get emotional about these different topics is important in order to let it out and then come back to a logical state where we can reason and find a conclusion or find a middle ground or something like that. I thought that was kind of an interesting way to put it, and it made me think about how I think people get into the state of entropy easily where the conversation is fueled and it heats up, but people have a really hard time utilizing that to run themselves out of fuel so then they can return back to the logical state and find something reasonable from there. I think people have a hard time getting back to that middle ground.
I have a hard time getting into the entropy.
Yeah. I mean, everyone's different too. I guess my point being is that I've seen a lot of entropy in the communication between people who have opinions that contradict one another.
What kind of conversations get you there, into that state of entropy? What pisses you off? Or makes you cry?
I think what upsets me the most is people who form ill-informed opinions based on a small subset of data that they do not understand whether it is manipulated or not. I think that what upsets me most. So,
why does that upset you?
Because I feel as though they have an opportunity to grow themselves and better themselves, and they have the opportunity to really at least like form their opinion to the fullest and form their perspective to the fullest. And I think there is a journey to be had there in order to develop yourself intellectually. And I think that they are restricting themselves from that opportunity. And I see that as sad because I see that a lot of people in my life and myself have grown immensely from going down that intellectual journey. And so when opinions are formed on a small subset of data that they do not understand whether it's factually true or not, I feel as though they have untapped potential. And so I want them to find that potential, even if they end up disagreeing with me or even if they end up holding the same opinion. So I think having that intellectual backing and going along that journey is really valuable to one's development.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I think that's where you and I differ.
Yeah.
Because I generally don't care if people get better or worse. People who I care about, I want to get better, but if they get worse, like my parents right now are like having a really difficult time together, and I would like them to work things out, but I also recognize that if you aren't open to new ideas, then that just won't happen, and so it's just not going to happen, and that doesn't really bother me.
Yeah, I feel like I have this drive to like help people think better. Like help people think about their lives and why they're doing what they're doing. Because it hurts me to see people act in ways that I think is destructive to their overall well-being. And I like it for example, I'll give you this example. So I was scrolling through TikTok the day after the election, and I saw this post, and it was like 768 in the last 24 hours or something like that. And I was like, what? And I looked into it, and like apparently 800 some odd people had killed themselves.
Jesus.
Because Trump had gotten elected, or at least that was the claim, right?
Got it.
And we can dive into like a data thing about like, okay, how many people statistically, terrible, but kill themselves per day, and how has the number changed since the election? How are these factors different? Like, what is causing this rate? Like, there's a lot of uncertainty in that, but the claim was like 800 people essentially have killed themselves after Trump was elected because they don't see a light in the future.
How do they know that one day after?
I don't know. They're definitely, at least to say, I didn't look into the data side of it. I just kind of took it for what it was.
I know that they track, the police department tracks suicides by gender and age. Yeah. So there's like the mental health awareness, like Movember and that whole thing. They track.
Maybe they're tracking by political affiliation too. Maybe that's how they're getting that number.
Yeah, but that's a fucking jump, right? Like,
yeah, no, I agree. The numbers are a jump. That's not quite the point I want to raise.
No, I understand. But what I'm saying is like, I'm even skeptical of that data set from this person, because it's like, how do you even know? It's not like you get on TikTok and say, I'm killing myself because Trump won, and then set the camera down, right? Like,
right.
Anyways, sorry to interrupt.
No, you're good. I think it is a far reach, but I think at least we could say that there are many people upset on the left because Trump won. Like, that has been clear. We've seen people upset on the internet.
Maybe they'll vote for Kamala in 2028.
Maybe.
People kill themselves.
Okay. That was terrible.
Okay, keep going.
Terrible.
It wasn't. 20 million less people voted this year than in 2020.
Yeah, but also 20 million more people voted in 2020 than they had in 2016.
That's exactly what I'm saying.
Yeah,
That's exactly what I'm saying.
yeah. No, yeah. It was a good joke, but a bad joke. Both. Anyways, the point I'm making.
Yeah,
is
I'm sure Mason and Sandra on Monday are gonna really hate
it. I'm not gonna care. The point I'm making is that I feel bad for people who take a small subset of information, or even if they have a large wealth of information, but then extrapolate it to being so upset that even the thought of ending one's life, even if those statistics aren't true, because of that situation is like a real thought for some people. Mm-hmm. Like I feel bad for those people. Like I feel empathy for those people who feel so upset and so sad, especially when I think there is a concrete argument on both sides to say that, we are not going to have a dictatorship, and it's not going to be a fascist regime, and Trump isn't a Nazi, because we had that for 4 years, and that was not at all how it was run. Of course, there were things that maybe some people disagreed with him about. There were things that I disagreed with him about. But all in all, it wasn't a fascist dictatorship, right? There were points that maybe people could argue it seemed a little bit dictator-like. Like, for example, with the Supreme Court ruling that gave some immunity to the president regarding certain official acts that he performs during his presidency, right? Like, some people could think that maybe that's a little bit dictatorship. I think there's a debate there. The point I'm saying is that I feel empathy for people who take their opinions to such extreme that they would be willing to think about or even end their life. Like, I feel bad.
Yeah. I think more criticism than empathy, especially in the sense that if it was a dictatorship, I think that we genuinely need as many people alive and fighting as possible to end the dictatorship, right? Especially in that case. I think that anybody who is in a space that is difficult enough that they're genuinely contemplating suicide, I do feel for. Mm-hmm. I think that everybody views the reason to kill themselves differently, right? So and this goes back to the percentage example we were talking about earlier, right? I would need an overwhelming amount of data to convince me to kill myself, right? And other people need far less. But that is sad to hear, if that statistic is true.
Yeah.
Regardless of whether it's for Trump or not, the suicide rate sucks. But on the Sean Ryan podcast, he had Trump on, and they were talking about the veteran suicide rate and different things they can do to decrease that, which is really awesome.
Yeah. True.
I think a lot of people get aggressive when they disagree with people for one of two major reasons. The first is an inability to receive judgment, like we spoke about earlier. And the second is viewing the opposite view as being flawed, and the other person's an idiot for not seeing the big picture, right? I struggle with the second one more so. I don't really get angry most of the time, but if I'm speaking to someone with what my perception is overwhelming fact, and the other person just doesn't agree, that I struggle to compete with. My mom struggles with both. I have written here. You think I'm an idiot, but you're the idiot. So she does it both ways. But I feel that this issue is usually rooted in the idea that there's a right answer. And sometimes I can personally forget that right is different for everybody. So sometimes I'll get into a debate, and it's not heated. It's more so like, I don't understand why you can think the way that you think because of all of this data in the opposite direction. But then I'll catch myself and I'll go, listen, like right is subjective, and it's all opinionated.
Yeah.
Right. It's all subjective.
I don't know if right is subjective.
For me, it's subjective.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think that the inability to understand.
I'm gonna listen to some podcasts about right and wrong this week. That's very
If you find good ones, let me know.
Yeah,
this is an original perspective. I haven't heard anything on this.
Yeah. I know that Jordan Peterson's talked a little bit about right and wrong and good and bad.
Mm-hmm.
But he is very taxing to listen to at times, because although he explains his position very well and very accurately, he uses a lot of verbiage that is challenging to swallow.
I think that I struggle to listen to him on YouTube or Spotify, but I think if I had a conversation in person and could contribute, it would be more interesting.
Yeah,
I just need to be more engaged with him, I think.
Yeah.
But I know that he does a lot of introspective thought like that.
Oh, yeah.
I get the feeling he'll have a different perspective, but that's okay. Because right is different for everybody. But I think that the biggest one is an inability to, like, even if I were applying judgment on you for your perspective, why do you care what I think about you? Right? Mm-hmm. I feel like a lot of people, when they perceive judgment from someone based on their opinion, they have a problem with that. And I don't understand that, because I don't feel anything if someone is judging me. So, like, if someone calls me an asshole because I voted for Trump in both the 2020 and 2024 election, it's like, okay. It kind of goes back to Hormozy's, you wouldn't be bothered if someone came up to you and said, you have purple hair. You'd be like, what are you talking about? No, I don't. Like, you wouldn't get upset because you know you don't have purple hair. Mm-hmm. So if someone comes up to you and says you're an asshole, you voted for Trump in both elections, you can go, I'm not an asshole. I didn't vote for Trump in both elections. Mm-hmm. I know I'm not an asshole. I don't have ill will for other people. I don't want other people to hurt. I want to help other people. So it almost doesn't bother me because I don't feel a reaction to judgment, but I feel that a lot of people do have that social pressure you're talking about, that their bubble's going to collapse.
Yeah, that social bubble and that social backlash, I think, is a factor for a lot of people. Do you want to dive into how to disagree with someone without hating them?
Sure. So as we defined earlier, disagreement does not require any amount of hatred. The two are completely isolated from one another. Therefore, hatred is not necessary in any situation in which two people disagree. And I believe that the solution begins with understanding that right and wrong are subjective. So let's get politically incorrect. Abraham Lincoln held the belief that slavery was wrong. Mm-hmm. Alexander the Great disagreed with that. Largely, everybody agrees with that today, that slavery is wrong, except for Xi Jinping, because he has slaves.
And Timu.
And Timu. Susan B. Anthony believed women deserved the same rights as men. Abraham Lincoln disagreed, because at that time, women didn't have rights.
Well, I mean, he may have agreed. He may have just not seen it as a priority over slavery. Right. I see your point, though.
Maybe. He didn't do anything about it.
Sure.
So for this,
maybe
there's literature or letters out there, even if he believed it, he didn't do anything about it. Modern day, largely everybody agrees women should have the same rights as men, apart from the Taliban. Mm-hmm. Actually, the Taliban recently instated law that women are not allowed to speak.
Really?
Ever. Even to other women, even to their men. They cannot speak.
Wow. That's wild. I'll have to look into that.
Yeah. And I think that's wrong. So I go to work every day to make sure that there's less of these people in the world. Adolf Hitler believed Jews were lesser than other races. The U.S. disagreed with that. Everyone today largely disagrees with that, apart from Xi Jinping. I believe sex with people below the age of consent is wrong. P. Diddy disagrees. Alexander the Great disagrees. Jeffrey Epstein disagrees. Generally, I think modern day people agree with me. The point here is that winners write the history books. So right versus wrong will always be skewed towards the winner's perspective, but ultimately the goalposts shift. Slavery, women's rights, gay rights, the right to bear arms, they were all seen as wrong once, and now they're seen as a right by many, but not all. A functional democracy leans towards the current majority, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's right. It's the current state. That's a better articulated. I forgot my entire segment was talking about this. I should have just skipped to it earlier.
That's okay.
Or pushed it off. Anyway. I forgot about it. But how do you think you can disagree without hating?
So just to clarify your point.
Sure.
You disagree about hating by acknowledging that right and wrong is subjective, and therefore there is no reason to hate someone because they might be right in their mind and you might be right in your mind, and that's okay.
Yeah.
Right? Okay. Cool.
Yeah.
I had a much more like a practice-oriented perspective on it. It wasn't as philosophical.
Yeah. I wrote nothing about how do you become okay with other people having their own right and wrong, because I don't know how to do that. I was just born this way. Or got over it.
Interesting. I'll think about it a little bit. I wrote, learning to emotionally control yourself, being aware of your emotional state before getting into a conversation, and recognizing that the value of a relationship, and recognizing the value of the relationship between you and the person you are talking to in order to help mediate that emotional state. Mm-hmm. So I think one practical thing you could do would be to kind of like tell yourself, like, I care about this person, they're valuable to me. Or even if you don't care about them and you don't feel like they're valuable, you could say, well, their life is valuable because they are an individual living in the same world that I am. And it's important to understand that my emotional reaction will not help better my mental state or their mental state, and therefore there is no real need to get super emotional or aggressive in a disagreement.
That's a great point. I can't think of any examples where emotion has aided the debate,
Right.
like made it better.
Yeah, like kind of like a self-recognition of like, I am not going to help this conversation in any way by getting angry.
Yeah.
Right. So
It
it's
makes
like why, so to kind of like see the value in that and kind of stem your argument from the value of being logical and polite.
Right. It makes it more entertaining for onlookers, but it doesn't actually help anything. And I think it's only entertaining really for people watching because
it's not entertaining for the people experiencing it. That's for sure.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Because you're not progressing. If you're in it, you just
unless you're like an outright, like unless you have psychopathic tendencies in your conversation, like unless you like get fueled by other people getting mad.
Yeah,
which is like kind of like a real negative energy. I don't think a lot of people feel that way.
Yeah, or if you're there to insult somebody, right? But it's even if you are mad. So like a few weeks ago, Grace was having a problem with someone at the bar. It was an older dude who was like hitting on her, and she was like, I have a boyfriend. He was like, oh, it's that blonde guy, right? And she was like, yeah. And he was like, oh, you guys don't seem like you're a good fit together. And she was like, we are, thanks though. And he was like, yeah, no, he doesn't strike me as that type of guy. You strike me like you've got a lot of like, you know, wifey traits. And she was like, no, thank you, I'm busy. And like put her headphones back on and he left. And so I confronted him about it. And I was like, hey man, just don't talk to her anymore. If you absolutely have to talk to her, keep it professional. And he immediately started like backtracking everything. And he came up with this whole story. And as he was telling me, he was trying to steelman it by having one of his friends be there to support him.
Yeah.
And as they were appealing to me, it wasn't changing my perspective on it at all. So I was just straight faced. And in the middle of talking, he was like, did you still seem upset though, even though I'm explaining all of this to you? And I was like, I'm not upset.
Yeah.
I'm skeptical. I don't believe you. And I just don't want you talking to her anymore. And just leave it at that. Right.
Yeah.
I don't hate you. I just want you to stop bothering my girlfriend. That's it.
Right.
Right. We're not going to exit this conversation as friends. I'm not going to like you. You just have to stop hitting on my girlfriend. Thanks. It's more of a matter of fact.
Yeah. I think additionally you can control your emotional state by changing the goal from convincing the other person of your opinion to growing with the other person through the conversation.
It's a good one.
If you're able to reframe your perspective to kind of grow together and understand one another rather than convince the other of your position, I think that's a better route to avoiding an aggressive, heated debate.
Yeah. I think the biggest emphasis on not convincing the other person is good, because then it seems like you're trying to sell them something, and that might shut them off to it.
Yeah.
Right.
And then additionally, I have some communication strategies and a couple other points that I think would be helpful to people to disagree with someone without hating them. So communication strategies, actively listening to the other person. I think if you actively listen, you can kind of see the humanity in the other person rather than like just the aspects of the argument that you disagree with.
Can you define actively listening?
So when actively listening, you want to actually make sure you're understanding what the other person is saying, making sure that you're processing the message they're trying to convey, rather than like inactive listening would be figuring out how you, while they're talking about their position, figuring out how you want to rebuttal to the conversation. I would argue is it can be active listening because there is a seed of you trying to understand their argument so that you can make yours, but it doesn't put you in their shoes to really concretely understand where they're coming from, because it leaves you in your shoes where you're still trying to push your argument onto them and convince them of something, rather than be one in that moment of exchange and learn to grow from that. And, make your point clear, but growth should be the objective. And I think that listening actively can help facilitate that growth.
Yeah, I think active listening is really the state of showing the other person that you hear them. So like reiterating their own point back to them to show that you are understanding, and then you can rebuttal after that. But I think that being heard is what's important, because if you say a bunch of stuff at me and a bunch of facts about the thing that we're talking about, and then I go, right, and then a bunch of facts the other direction, that doesn't really show that I listened to anything that you said, because I had those facts beforehand. I'm not using any new information.
Right. Very fair point. Maintaining respect, I think, is important to avoiding a heated debate or a confrontation that's argumentative. And to maintain respect, you can be empathetic without condescending, I think. And that kind of ties into active listening, where you can kind of put yourself in their shoes and understand where they're coming from. But I noted to avoid being condescending, because I think a lot of people can jump into another person's shoes and then use that process of understanding their perspective to make them seem silly. Like what? To essentially, what I'm saying is, like, don't use empathy in order to wield the tools to then throw back at them. Like, for example, with the example of the bananas and the apples that we had earlier, I could have wielded that example and been like, well, that's just such a primitive, stupid outlook on the situation. Like, obviously, we're not going to disagree about apples and bananas this much, right? Like, I could have taken that, but instead, I chose actively to use that as a vehicle to discuss the conversation and to discuss the topics, and then stem from that a growth period. Right. Whereas, like, I could have just shut down and put a superficial wall up and said, no, that's stupid. Like, I don't see your point. Like, apples and bananas, like, what are we talking about here? Right. Like, I could have been condescending in that way, and I could have gotten the inspiration for that condescending act from jumping into your part of the conversation and jumping into your shoes from your perspective, but then turning it against you in a rude way, right? Which is something that I think should actively choose not to do.
I agree.
Avoid, in that same sense, avoiding negative sarcasm, like sarcasm that is intended to make the other person feel bad.
Really?
Yeah, that's not a great way to... if you're being sarcastic to hurt the other person, that's not a great way to mediate the conversation effectively.
Yeah. I think any sarcasm in a serious discussion is a really great way of insulting someone.
Yeah. I think when used very carefully with humor, it can help alleviate the conversation.
Yeah, that's true.
But I think by and large, when sarcasm, I think it's like, when it comes from a good place, I think it can be portrayed well, but every single time it comes from a bad place, it is portrayed poorly.
Yeah. I think in a debate setting, it's best used against yourself in a self-deprecating manner, or in effect to point out that your side is, maybe a little silly in one instance, or it's actually not that silly, and you're exemplifying that by being sarcastic.
Right. Yeah. I agree. And then in that, if you're able to be empathetic and avoid sarcasm and be an active listener, I think you can actively disagree with the ideas that the person has rather than who the person is. Just utilizing those vehicles to kind of center yourself around that this person is a human being. I value their life. I value my life. I value their perspective. I want to understand where they come from. And I think once you do that, you value the person, which then, even if ideas that they present disagree with your ideas, they are separated from the value of that human being, right? And then lastly, I have some tidbits for conflict resolution.
Can I jump in on the values?
Yeah, go for it.
I feel that I felt a lot of judgment from that girlfriend in the 2020 election when she was like, I don't know if I want to date you anymore, after being together for 5 years and having very few genuine disagreements and arguments.
Yeah.
Because all of a sudden I have all of these labels attributed to me that she didn't resonate with. I feel that I've seen this a lot in the LGBTQ community, like through like the 2019, 2020 era. But it was almost like your opinion on a few instances defines you as a person and your core values and morals.
Yeah.
And that's really sucks, because I've had a lot of friends, dude, most of my friends, I don't know their political stance, and I'm good friends with them.
Yeah.
I enjoy their company. And they could be on the totally other side of the aisle as I am, and it doesn't really matter because it doesn't change that interaction that we have on day to day. Like you and I could just talk about race cars for the rest of our lives, and it doesn't matter how we feel about abortion. You know what I mean? It only political stance only matters when it's a conversation that you want to have routinely with someone. And if that is important to you, then you need to make sure that the people in your life also hold that in high importance so that you can have that conversation, right? Like you and I wouldn't be as good of friends if I didn't care about race cars, because that's a big thing for you, right?
Sure.
I feel that for these people, their race cars is whatever political movement, right? They talk about that all the time. That's their special interest. So they look for people who also have that special interest. The problem is I can like Mercedes and you can like BMWs, and it's okay because we like race cars. But if you get somebody who wants to talk about abortion all the time and they're pro-abortion, they're not going to be friends with someone who's anti-abortion, because it's kind of like being friends with someone who's like anti-race cars. You both like to talk about race cars, but one of them wants to get rid of them and wants to have more. The other one has to have more of them, right? But it's really difficult for me to understand that, because it's kind of like your political views are largely based around morality, right? Mm-hmm. It's like if you think that the economy is more important than universal healthcare, you could say that you are a more analytical person and you don't care about people as much, right? But that isn't really always the case, and that's not really always true. To a degree it is, but it doesn't define you strictly as a person. So one might think that you would be more compatible with someone with similar political views as you, but there are many instances where that isn't the case, and I think it's only the case when someone doesn't get upset at different political views.
Yeah. On the topic of moral alignment between the people that you surround yourself with, mm-hmm. right? Do you think that morals stem from right and wrong?
I think that morals stem from a self-perception of right and wrong.
Okay. So I think there's a little bit of a contradiction. Maybe you can clarify it for me. I would agree that morals stem from right and wrong, and I would agree that people tend to get along with people who have like morals and values, mm-hmm. right? But then at the same time, I guess where I get a little bit lost is if you believe that right and wrong is genuinely individual for every single person, why do the differentiating values or morals of different people affect your relationship with them? Does that make sense? Do you want me to repeat it in a different way?
I think so. I think that people with similar morals have similar definitions of right and wrong.
Right. But I guess the point I'm saying is, like, if your perspective is that everyone has their individual right and wrong and that's okay, why is there a differentiation between who you get along better with and who you don't get along as well with?
I think the point that I'm making is I'm able to get along. I think that the point that I'm making is in modern days, people only want to get along with people who they agree, who have similar morals. But mm-hmm. I think that my definition of right and wrong is independent of yours, and it doesn't define us as people. We can be friends anyways.
But wouldn't you say you have a stronger bond with people that do have moral and value alignment with you?
I don't know. I have personally experienced...
I mean, you said that part of our alignment was our equal interest in race cars, right? So that has contributed to our connection, right?
Right.
If I was like...
But is that a moral?
No. Let's actually bring it to something more. That's a good point.
Right.
I would say I was liberal when we started being friends, mm-hmm. right? But we were still... I think that our political alignment also benefited our friendship. And I don't know if it would have benefited our friendship in the same way as it would have if I had stayed very left-leaning and not found rhyme or reason in I don't want to say that. If I had not transformed my perspectives, I think that would we would have resulted in a weaker friendship or weaker relationship.
I think this is a great example of the point that I'm trying to make.
Okay.
Which is, I think that we became friends because of our love for engineering and race cars. And I think that that is the foundation of our friendship. And the political beliefs isn't as important as what our interests are and what our likes are day to day. But I feel that in modernity, people take their values and their morals and they change out the importance of the day-to-day race cars with their political views. So their political views is what they want to talk about all the time and what their special interests are and what they want to bond with other people over. I don't really care. I don't really want to bond with other people about their morals because it doesn't matter to me what their morals really are. I really care more about the superficial stuff like race cars. Like what makes you unique.
Okay.
So the example with you and I is a little bit tricky because I would be friends with you either way. But
interesting.
Maybe there's someone in your life who you were friends with at first, but then they had different political views than you, and you each really care about your political views a lot, and you didn't have as strong of a friendship because you didn't agree about them. But I'm a little bit different because we can have different political views. Like when we met and you were liberal, or right now I think you're even a little more right-leaning than I am, but it doesn't matter to me.
Yeah. No, I think I am too.
Right.
It's interesting. I think that gets to the crux of our disagreement. Not really disagreement, but like a different way of looking at right versus wrong and morals and values and how they affect the potential prosperity of a relationship or friendship.
Yeah. Elaborate.
I think or at least I'll speak for myself that I have a couple of things concretely that I need from the other people in my life in order to effectively bond with them. And I can effectively communicate with anyone, but to effectively bond with someone, I think there are a couple core things that I need in alignment, like clear communication or critical thought. Right. Whereas like, are you making, correct me if I'm wrong, are you making the argument that like the alignment of critical thinking and the people that you surround yourself with, or the alignment of the importance of critical thought is not as important as like more superficial interest alignment?
I think that I am able to build stronger bonds with people who I agree with on more daily topics. So like I choose to not talk about abortion and the economy and immigration every day because those are not very interesting to me. What is interesting to me is business and race cars and rowing. So the people who I have shared interests with, I get along with really well. But somebody who wants to talk about all the political things all the time, I probably won't be as bonded as strongly with because those are just things that I don't think about all the time, even if we are in agreement. But I think the point of what I'm making is I think that it's become very popular to talk about those political beliefs, and therefore it becomes a part of that person's identity and the things that they talk about every day. So the way that you lean is important to them because they will look at you and define you as, well, they don't think the same way as I do. I talk about this all the time. Maybe this is why the LGBTQ community, because it's a big part of a lot of LGBTQ members' identity is those topics. Those aren't really topics that I talk about every day, but it is topics they talk about every day. So if I don't particularly care about it, then they probably won't form a strong bond with me because it's not a special interest of mine. I don't have any issue with it, but I don't want to spend all day talking about it. I'd rather talk about race cars.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, I think I see your point more clearly now.
Right. But the issue is when those people say, oh, it's not an interest of yours, you don't want to talk about it every day, therefore you actively disagree with me and think that my position is invalid. That's the major issue. Because just because I don't want to talk about it every day doesn't mean that I don't care about it, or I don't think it's important to me, or I think that you should be punished for thinking that. It's just not interesting to me. It's just not something that I want to spend all day talking about. I don't dedicate a ton of thought to it.
Yeah. I see your point. It's interesting. It's been a good conversation. I
agree. I've
definitely learned and seen a different perspective on it, and I have some stuff to think about. And it makes me curious. So
about what?
just like generally like how you form bonds with people. What do you value versus not? How do you differentiate between right and wrong? How is that important in the relationships that you build? Stuff like that.
I think that ultimately identifying what makes a strong bond with somebody could be a podcast in itself. I think that's interesting.
Yeah,
it's an interesting thought, because that helps you identify, well, who is a potential friend. It's kind of like when you are on a dating app and you match with someone, what are the first 5 things you talk about? Because those are probably the things that are like the most important to you, right? Like that's what you should cut down to right away. So what are the things that are most important to you? And I think that the major issue is a lot of people think nowadays, if you don't talk about these important issues that are important to me, then you need to start, because they're important to me, so they have to be important to you. And then if you disagree, they go, well, what the hell? Because this is really important. They leave out the to me. They just think it's important in general. And if you disagree, then you disagree with this really important position, and I'm upset with you because you're small-minded and you're an idiot. And I think that's really closed-minded. And people don't often recognize that just because it's important to you doesn't mean it's important to everybody. And just because you think that you're right doesn't mean that other people are wrong. You can both be right in your own sense.
I think the differentiation for me comes in is that people have the right to feel as though something is important to them or not, but when their actions affect a broad range of other people, I think it's inherently important that you think about your actions.
Yeah.
For example, like yelling fire in a crowded theater, right? Like you may think that's fine, but when you yell fire in a crowded theater, you implicate a lot of other people into a state of panic, and you create a situation of high risk for a lot of the people around you. And no longer is your opinion just your opinion, but it is at a primordial, is that the word?
I don't know.
Level, is at like a primitive level. It is instigating a reaction on other people that is negative.
Right.
And so like, I think it's important to consider that in, I guess your expression, or what you put value on and versus what you don't.
Yeah. I think it's important to consider, firstly, identify what your key bonding metrics are for other people, and then identify what your definition of right versus wrong is on different topics, and then consider how that definition fits in with society today. Because you'll have to change your actions based on that. For instance, if you think that it's okay to shout fire in a crowded building in a movie theater, that isn't acceptable in our society. So maybe go try to find a society where that is acceptable so you can be more comfortable, because you can't do it here. Similarly, when you're upset with someone, you can't punch them in the face. We don't do that here.
Right.
You know, you go live in the jungle, you can do it there, I'm sure. But when it comes to major political issues and stuff like that, generally, I think, you know, give a lot of thought to it, but also recognize there might be other people giving similar amounts of thought to it who just come to a different outcome. And that doesn't mean that you're wrong. Other people disagreeing with you doesn't mean that you're wrong. You don't have to get upset about it. Because in every instance, getting upset about it and getting heated, it doesn't do anything.
It doesn't help.
Yeah. You can disagree and you can argue till the cows come home, but just be civil about it, because there's no benefit to getting upset.
Yeah. And then stemming off that same topic, I had a couple bullet points about conflict resolution, and finding common ground in your debate or in your conversation is an important step to accepting the differences between the both of you, because at the end of the day, you're both humans, you're both have opinions about a certain topic. You know, you could find even common ground in the fact that you value this certain topic, even if you disagree about every single aspect of it.
Yeah.
Right. So finding common ground, and then in that agreeing to disagree about some certain things, I think is important, because otherwise you get into a position where you either cannot emotionally like mediate yourself, or if you cannot agree to disagree, you get into a mindset where you feel as though you have to agree with the people around you in order to fit into the social bubble that you've constructed in your own mind and given value to far beyond what, you know, it is worth to your own personal being. I mean, I guess I just thought it was kind of conversely, like, if you personally, I guess our only like a small stipulation that I've just come across is like, we say to not value other people's opinion because your opinion is the most important to you. But if someone else has the perspective that other people's opinion are more important than their opinion, then they may feel as though like someone telling them that their opinion is wrong is more important than their own opinion. That wasn't very clear. But
You mean if
what
someone,
I'm
if
saying
someone,
is like if someone values social opinions and fitting in socially more than they value their own opinion, and that's one of their foundational beliefs, then like I guess a lot of the stuff we're saying kind of gets thrown out the window in terms of conflict resolution.
maybe, but you could also argue that the easiest way to end conflict is to just succumb and agree, right? But that's not really, I would argue that's not an optimal resolution, because that's just bending the knee and going with whatever other people say. You don't have independent thought. You don't have critical thinking at that point. You just kind of bend to the wind.
Yeah, and inherently saying that, it puts a value on critical thinking and thought, right? But if someone feels as though critical thinking and thought is not important to them, then I guess it's just interesting, because I guess the point I'm internally making in my head and not conveying very clearly even to myself is, once everything at least from what I'm superficially seeing from the small amount of analysis that I have done on the fly, when everything seems relative, there seems to be no finite construct of what is a good approach versus a bad approach.
Right. There is only your approach.
Right.
But the purpose of this podcast is to document our approach to these things.
True.
And then see how that changes over time. Because I can guarantee you, we're going to have different opinions and different approaches on half of these things when we're 50.
Right.
Going back and looking on these things.
Right. Good point. So to finish off my bullet points without getting too introspective and diving down the rabbit hole, focusing on future solutions rather than past disagreements, I think, is valuable in order to resolving conflict.
I think so.
And maintaining priority for a long-term prosperity with the person that you're talking to can be an important outlook when trying to see the humanity in the other person, even if you disagree about every single thing. Even if you don't necessarily want a long-term relationship with the stranger you just bumped into and had a disagreement with about, seeing the opportunity for a longer, better relationship with this person can help mediate your emotional state so that you don't get upset and turn the conversation into just a shouting match.
Right.
But that is all I had.
That's all I have.
Cool.
I can throw
that was a lot of all I had, but was a lot.
I can throw you into another self-respective spiral into introspection if you'd like, but I think that we could probably call it here. So we like to end each episode with a single quote that kind of surmises everything that we've been talking about, just to cap off the episode and give you something to think about moving forward. I personally, at work, we've got Skype accounts, and you can write like a little daily message in the Skype, and every day I pick a new quote. But recently I've been taking the last quote from the previous podcast, and then I think about that through most of the week. And then around Thursday, I pick a new one, and that's what I go with. So the quote that inspired me this week was an Alex Hormozi quote. And it says, "Maturing is realizing you can hate an idea without hating the human who believes it." Thanks for listening.
Yeah, have a great week. Enjoy, and don't think too hard, but think a little bit.
Don't think too hard. You'll hurt yourself.
Think about as you see fit.